Hi, it's Sherry. Welcome to Canterbury Cottage. If you know me, you know I love clocks, and I buy them all the time when shopping at thrift stores. As a result, I have acquired quite a collection. So I decided to make a video featuring a variety of ideas for upcycling and repurposing old clocks. I'll be showing you how to turn clocks into one-of-a-kind home decor, and conversely, turning random items from around the house into adorable clocks. It's easier than you think. I absolutely love how all of these projects turned out and would like to keep them all. But I promised myself that from now on, I would only keep one project per week. So see if you can guess which one I'll be keeping this week, and I'll tell you at the end of the video. Well, I have so many fun ideas to share with you today, so let's get started. For this first project, I'll be using a pendulum clock. Unfortunately, I forgot to turn on the camera when I was removing the inner parts. Luckily, it's very easy. It's just a matter of removing a few screws. I gave the case a couple coats of chalk paint, and when the paint was dry, I lightly distressed it with 220 grit sandpaper. Then I applied a coat of clear wax using a wax brush to get into all the crevices. The backing on the clock did not cover the area directly behind the clock face, so I cut a new, larger piece of backing out of a piece of hard cardboard. Then I used a glue stick to attach some old sheet music over the piece of cardboard. I trimmed up the edges with scissors and then slid the cardboard into place. I hot glued a couple sticks from my yard into the clock, and then I added a little fake greenery, and finally I added a bird nest. I always use Gorilla brand hot glue sticks, and I find that things stick and stay put really well. At this point, I decided to add an IOD bird transfer to the sheet music. It would have been easier to do this at the start, but actually it ended up working out just fine. I think you know that I was not going to let the clock face from the pendulum clock go to waste, and I thought that it might just be the perfect size to adhere to a round wicker basket. I removed the hands from the clock face, making sure to keep all the parts in the correct order for reassembling. Then I removed the clock face from the piece of wood and gave it a couple coats of black spray paint. I printed out an image of a vintage clock face, cut it out, and then using glue stick I adhered it over the original clock face. Then, using an X-Acto knife and a pair of small scissors, I cut out the hole in the center. I also made a hole in the center of the wicker basket. First, I drilled a hole, and then I made it larger using a pair of scissors. I used hot glue to attach the clock box to the back of the wicker basket and to attach the clock face to the front of the basket. If you should forget how to reassemble the clock hands, you can find diagrams like this one online to help you. Recently, a viewer asked for ideas for repurposing embroidery hoops. Well, here is one fun idea. Stretch a piece of pretty fabric, like a quilt remnant, into your embroidery hoop. Trim off the excess fabric, and then select a variety of interesting buttons to represent the numbers on your clock. You can buy a clock kit, or you can just buy a clock at the thrift store and reuse the hands and clock parts. Like I did on the previous project, I just keep the parts in order so that I can quickly reassemble the clock. I had planned on cutting a round circle from a piece of cardboard to put inside the embroidery hoop, but as it turned out, one of the wood rounds from my thrifted clock fit perfectly, so I used it instead. I used some small screws and hot glue to adhere the wood round to the embroidery hoop. There was already a hole in the center, making it easy for me to cut a hole through my fabric with an X-Acto knife, and then I attached the clock and the clock hands. I still had the glass shield and the wood frame left from the wall clock I used in the previous project, and I decided to use them separately. I thought a floral IOD transfer would look great on the round piece of glass. So I cut out the section that I wanted to use and applied it to the front of the glass using the plastic tool supplied with the IOD transfers. Somehow I lost a little piece of stem during the transfer, so I cut out another leaf and applied it to hide the mistake. I screwed in a little D-ring to use for hanging. I still had that pretty round wood frame from the clock left, and I sure couldn't let it go to waste. So I painted it with a couple coats of moss green chalk paint, and when the paint was dry, I lightly distressed it and then applied a thin coat of clear wax. I cut out a circle of heavy cardboard to fit inside the clock, and then I covered the cardboard with a piece of needlepoint that I picked up at the thrift store for just $1.99. I adhered the extra fabric to the back of the cardboard using Gorilla brand hot glue. I just worked my way around and occasionally cut slits in the fabric so that it would lay down on the cardboard flatter. Although the cardboard fit snugly inside the wood frame, I went around with some hot glue to make sure that it stayed put. To make the back look nicer, I went ahead and reattached the original clock backing. In case you don't have a lovely needlepoint to use, here is another idea for repurposing a round clock frame. Like before, I painted mine with a couple coats of chalk paint, lightly distressed it, and then applied a coat of clear wax. I repurposed a bird's nest and some flowers from a thrifted wreath, attaching them to the back of the clock with staples. I then added some additional greenery by sticking the stems into the bird's nest and securing them with a dot of hot glue. For my next project, I decided to turn a small resin clock into a pretty piece of home decor. The clock actually popped right out, and then I painted it with a couple coats of celery green chalk paint. When the paint was dry, I lightly distressed it with 220 grit sandpaper, and then I applied a coat of white wax, just lightly dabbing off the excess. I cut a circle of paper to fit inside the clock opening and used it as a template to cut a circle from a book page. Once my circle was cut out, I applied glue stick to the back to adhere it into the clock opening. Then I hot glued a small wreath that I had into the opening over the book page. To embellish the wreath, I hot glued on some faux greenery, a couple tiny little animals, and a few little flowers. I didn't want to waste the actual clock parts from the previous project, so I looked around my stash and decided to use it with an old Jello mold. I painted the inside of the mold with a couple coats of white chalk paint, and when the paint was dry, I lightly distressed it with 220 grit sandpaper. Then I attached the clock to the center of the Jello mold with super glue. I found a few small kitchen-themed items in my stash that I hot glued into the bottom of the Jello mold. I also tied a ribbon around a bunch of faux rosemary and glued that into the Jello mold. As a finishing touch, I printed out a vintage recipe card image on a small piece of cardstock to add to this kitchen vignette. I used E6000 to attach a small D-ring to the back of the Jello mold. I recently picked up a broken but very pretty wall clock at the thrift store. I removed its one clock arm and the clock box on the back, and then I painted the clock face with a couple coats of chiffon cream chalk paint. I trimmed up the front half of some Dollar Tree butterfly stickers and hot glued them to the clock face in place of the numbers. Then I carefully removed the clock hands and clock box from another thrifted clock that I had in my stash and reassembled them on my new butterfly clock. When I was looking for the Jello mold, I happened across this old enamel pot lid with its knob missing. Clock kits cost about $9 or $10 on Amazon, but I had picked one up at the thrift store for $1.99. I hot glued the clock box to the back of the lid and a large washer to the front of the lid to conceal the large hole, and then I attached the clock hands. I decided to add an old wood handle off of a steak knife, and so I broke off the blade, and then I drilled a hole in one end of the wood handle to run some twine through. I filled the hole at the opposite end of the handle with some hot glue and E6000, and then pushed it on a small piece of metal that was sticking out from the side of the lid. A clock video just wouldn't be complete if I didn't include an anniversary clock. This one happens to be one of those miniature anniversary clocks. They are made almost entirely of plastic, so you'll need a good pair of wire snips just to cut everything apart. Once everything was removed, there were 3 small holes left in the base, and I decided to put a small stick into one of them. I secured it with some hot glue, and then I glued some moss on the base to cover up the other 2 holes. Then I hot glued a butterfly sticker and some tiny flowers to the sticks. I decided to use the small clock face from the anniversary clock in this next project. I wanted to create a miniature kitchen scale, and so I printed out a small scale face to cover up the clock face. The clock didn't have a glass shield, so I just cut it out and applied it directly over the clock face with glue stick. To create the body of the clock, I found 1 small square and 1 small rectangular scrap of wood. I would use a jar lid for the weighting platform. I gave all of the scale parts a couple coats of black spray paint, and when the paint was dry, I began assembling the scale. Using super glue, I attached the square piece of wood to the back of the clock and the rectangular piece of wood to the bottom of the clock to create a base. Then I glued 2 small blocks of wood to the top of the square piece of wood and then glued the lid to the top of the 2 blocks. I ended up using a different lid than I had originally planned, and so I painted it with some black chalk paint and touched up the black paint on the wood blocks as well. To make it look aged, I distressed it a little with 220 grit sandpaper, and then I applied a coat of clear wax. When I bought this clock a couple years ago, I had plans to fix it, but it turned out to be much more damaged than I expected, and it continues to deteriorate. So I'm going to turn it into a pretty wall shelf. I removed the remaining ornate wood pieces that had once framed the clock face. This would open up the shelf and create space to actually put some objects there. Of course, I saved all of these pieces to use as pediments in future projects. I sanded down any rough spots and then I sprayed it all over with a good primer. Then I brush painted on 2 coats of chiffon cream chalk paint. When the paint was dry, I lightly distressed it with 220 grit sandpaper and then applied a coat of clear wax to the entire piece. I thought the top part needed a little something, and so I super glued on a Dollar Tree wood cutout and then painted it with the same chiffon cream chalk paint and lightly distressed it. Unfortunately, I didn't get a picture of this next clock before I started transforming it. I cut up a 1x4 into 5 small pieces of staggering lengths to create a small staircase. I used wood glue and a clamp to glue the 5 pieces together. After the glue was dry, I used additional wood glue to glue the stairs to the back side of the clock, just under the little door. I removed the latch from the door and painted the body of the clock with sage chalk paint. I painted the roof with hazelnut and the stairs in a dark gray. I removed the clock from the front and created a little window using a wood frame from Dollar Tree. I glued in a small piece of flimsy plexiglass and created panes using some tiny little craft sticks. I just cut them with regular scissors and hot glued them in place. Then I hot glued the window inside over the opening where the clock had once been. I drilled a hole over the small door on the back side and then inserted a strand of battery-operated fairy lights inside the clock. I pushed the last light on the strand through the drilled hole and hot glued it in place. I cut a hole in a miniature lantern left over from Christmas and then pushed it over the light and hot glued it in place. I had some miniature trophies left over from something. I cut off the handles and painted them gray to make them look like planters. I used a paint pen to add some details to the door and glued on a wood bead for a knob. I added greenery to the planters and made a wreath for the door. I wanted to make even more decorations for this little house, but I needed to finish up the video. I hope you enjoyed today's video because I sure had fun making it. Here's the clock that I'm keeping. I wonder which one would you have kept? If you like this type of video, I'll be sure to link another where I present multiple ways for upcycling and repurposing old picture frames. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so very much for watching, and I hope to see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye for now.